Good seeing you. I'd like to welcome you for another INNOQ Technology Lunch. Today with me is my wonderful colleague Joy. Hi, Joy.
Hi.
We see people still trickling in. Nevertheless, we should start. All right. I have with me today Joy, and Joy will be giving us a short and maybe interactive demo into CSS Grid. Exactly, she will be doing some live coding, I hear, and she will be showing how to do responsive web layout with a small example web page using the native CSS Grid. And maybe, I think you'll tackle Flexbox shortly, yes. Right?
Okay. Yes, I will be using Flexbox as well.
Cool. So let me shortly explain how it works. If you never joined an INNOQ Technology Lunch, I will be phasing out my video and my audio shortly, and Joy will be with you all the time, giving her demo, and you can ask questions all the time. Please, if you're joining via Zoom, use the Q&A function. It's in the small toolbar at the bottom. Or if you're joining on YouTube, feel free to ask the chat at any time to pose questions. If Joy is able to, while she's giving the demo, she will have a look at the chat window and in the Q&A window as well, and answer questions while she gives the demo. Otherwise, we'll tackle all your questions after the demonstration. And yeah, so that's all we need to know to run this thing. I wish you joy. I wish you lots of fun. And hand over to you now. Enjoy.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I think I need to share my screen. So, yeah. So thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you Robert for the introduction. Yeah, I do want to have fun today. So I want to have fun playing around with CSS, looking at, sorry, I think my screen is not shared yet. Now it's shared. Can everyone see everything? Hope everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, I see it clearly.
You can see it clearly. Okay, so I hope everyone else can see it as well. Yeah, as Robert said, if you do have questions, you can type them in the Zoom chat. I do have the window open. I'm not sure how much I'll be able to answer them. There are some things that I want to show today. And so what I'm going to start out with is this pure HTML page that you see here. So here we have absolutely no CSS, which is currently activated. And this is just some, it's kind of the normal web page that you would see. There's a nav bar up here. There's a title for the page. There's a search bar, and then some content. I took this content from the INNOQ homepage. And then here at the bottom, there's a newsletter form. And I want to show how we can do some layout and CSS using modern CSS. So I'm going to be showing some modern CSS things today. I'll be showing Flexbox. I'll kind of start out with Flexbox, actually. Showing CSS Grid. I want to talk about why you would use CSS Grid versus Flexbox. You can use them together. That's a question that's often asked. So now that we have CSS Grid, what's Flexbox useful for? Well, you can use them in combination with each other. So I'll talk about that a little bit today. And also I'm going to be using CSS properties, which is a newer CSS spec. I don't know if it's a spec. It's a newer CSS function. Or a function? No, it's also not a function. It's a CSS thing. Yeah, I don't know what exactly it's called. It's like variables. So I'll be talking about CSS properties, and I also want to show some other cool CSS tricks. So just to kind of show what modern CSS today can do. So I'm going to start out. What I want to do is the first thing I've created some base styling, which I'm just going to comment in here. So these are CSS properties. I've created some the colors I want to use in my design. I've assigned to CSS properties so then I can access them within my CSS code. So that's what a CSS property looks like. It begins with 2 dashes and then the property name. And I also have a box shadow that I've defined here. These colors and shadows are all taken from Tailwind CSS. I personally don't like the utility CSS approach. I'm not going to talk about that today. If you are interested in that, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. But I do love their design. They have absolutely amazing design. So I steal their CSS stuff all the time because the design part of the Tailwind UI framework, the Tailwind CSS framework is just amazing. And so if I do that, you can kind of see there is a bit of a improvement. Mainly here, it just changed the typography to use the default, so system UI that chooses the sans serif font from the Mac system, so it's a little bit nicer typography here, which is the first step I want to take. And the next step I want to take is when I look at this, if I want to make this look nice, one of the most important things that I've learned, I'm a developer, not a designer, but I try to make my pages look not horrible. And one thing I've learned is that what makes the most difference in a good design is actually the white space within the design, and that makes it makes a huge difference. And that kind of was counterintuitive to me when I began. I was like, why? The white space is exactly what's not there. So why is the white space so important? But I found that if you use white space, you can and you use a scale. So you don't say, I'm just going to push pixels around everywhere. If you say, if I decide this is 10 pixels tall and this is 20 pixels tall, then I'm going to get some kind of really odd design. It's not going to be consistent. It's not going to feel right. It feels off. So what you can do is you can create some explicit spacing variables and just use those in your design. So you're saying, I'm just going to constrict myself to these values. And so there's different scales, like spacing, types of spacing that you can use. Today I'm going to be using the Fibonacci scale, because Fibonacci is easy to calculate. There's other ones. Modular scale is one that I've been playing around with recently, but that one it's a more mathematical model, and you have to use a calculator and then copy values over. But with Fibonacci, I can just define my Fibonacci values. So I start with 0.25, and then I can add that to itself, get 0.5, and then I can just add them all together. So I'm just going to define a scale. This is the Fibonacci values. It's 1.25. Space large would be 2. Is that correct? Space XL would be 3.25 rem. Space XXL would be 5.25. And so here I'm using rem as my unit. And rem is a unit which is based on the default font size of a browser, which is by default 16 pixels. But the nice thing about using rem as opposed to, so 1 rem is equal to 16 pixels. The nice thing about using rem as opposed to pixels is that when I zoom in my browser, it will zoom proportionally. So my spacing will zoom proportionally to the content. And that's really why I love it so much. So if I want something that won't zoom, I would use pixels. But if I want something like a border, that's pretty much the only time I would ever use pixel, because I want my borders to stay the same regardless of the zoom. But for all other spacing kind of things, I use rem. And I've actually gotten to the point where I really think in rem now as opposed to pixel. Pixel is kind of arbitrary. It used to mean 1 pixel is like 1 pixel on my screen, but now with the new screen and the new resolutions, that's actually not true anymore either. So I think pixels are a bit of an old concept, and I currently don't use them anymore. So if I do that, it doesn't actually change anything because I haven't written any CSS which uses these variables yet. But I do want to do, here I'm doing a CSS reset. Sorry, that's a CSS reset, not an HTML reset. And here I want to just reset like the list. Here I'm not going to style a list as a list in any of my HTML. So I'm going to reset that, and I'm going to reset the margins here. That looks kind of scary to me, so I'm just going to do, just for my it's like everything is so close to each other, so it's a bit scary. So I'm just going to create, so that with this kind of code, I like this CSS syntax. This means the direct child of my main element. So if I look at my HTML code, the direct, so I've as I said before, I have these different blocks, and this is my main element, which has my main content. And so the here, what I can do is I can say if I want to use the direct child of main, then I can set this selects the children that are direct children of main, and the star will select any child which is a direct child of main. So I'm going to give it every child which is a direct child of main. The spacing is small. Let's see how that looks. So it's a little bit, I mean, these are still not, they're not style, but at least, let me see. At least it's a little bit of styles. Someone asked, why is the convention used to start with 2 underscores? I think that's just the syntax of the CSS properties as it's been defined. I don't know if there's another underlying meaning behind that. And the other question is, should we use CSS or some preprocessor like less? I do like Sass, but I'm not sure about that. I think with using Sass, you can modularize your CSS a little bit, so I like doing that. But I also think now with the CSS properties and different things, you can also use pure CSS. You can't, like with this, I'm going to have to be, with pure CSS, vanilla CSS, you also don't have the nesting of different CSS. If you want to write like nested commands, you have to write everything, like you can't like nest another CSS command inside this. So it's a little bit of a preference thing. I use personally for my personal site, which has a small amount of CSS, I like to write vanilla CSS, but I also see the value of a preprocessor like Sass if you want to use that. Anyway. So now here I'm just going to comment this, and this is adding some styles to. I'm just going to add some style. So this is adding some styles. I defined these beforehand, and this is just to style this newsletter form and this search bar. And I don't have the time to go into that today, but I will put this in a GitHub repository and upload it if you want to look at that code later. So the first thing I want to do is I want to style this navbar element, which is up here. So here I'm going to, if I look at this, in my navbar, I have a nav element. I'm using semantic HTML, and I have this brand div, which is where I'm going to have my logo and maybe a toggle later, and I have my list of elements here. So the reason I'm using a UL inside the nav is that for a screen reader, the UL, the list element, actually gives the screen reader extra context, so that the navbar, they don't, like, you can, it's also semantically correct HTML to just have anchor elements. So inside my LEs, I have the anchor link elements. You can just have these anchor elements inside the navbar directly, but adding a UL around that gives the screen reader this more context. So the screen reader will then read out the number of elements which is in your navigation bar. So I like to do that when I can. And so first of all, I'm going to start out doing the kind of responsive design. So I'm going to assume that my viewport is small, and I want to this is kind of what I want it to look like, actually. On a mobile screen, I want the links to be shown under each other, but I do want a little bit of style. So what I want is my brand item, and I also want the ULs. I'm going to just say navbar, the LE elements, really. I'm going to give them a padding of small. Okay. Let's see how that works. So then here I can see that I also want to give my navbar, I'm going to give it a box shadow. So that it's here. And I also want my A elements, I want to give them give it a hover So do something like navbar A. This is kind of where you can see where having a preprocessor, I'm having to repeat navbar, which I do that because I need, like, I want to have good scoping for my CSS. But here I'm having to repeat this navbar, so that's where a preprocessor like Sass could possibly help. But here I want my text decoration none, and I want hover to be background color. And I'm gonna look here, I'm gonna use a gray shade. So here, now I have, why isn't that working? Should I save? It is not dot hover, it is just hover. Yeah, so then I have a hover, and I also want the color here to be something like this. And I think I would just add I also want here the color to be the same. Just a little styling. And the main thing is now, so that, like, here I'm starting out, and this is by default, this is without JavaScript enabled. This is absolutely no JavaScript. So this is when JavaScript is not enabled. I like to keep my navbar toggled out so that I have access to all the links. But ideally, because especially on a mobile device, my screen real estate is so small. So ideally, I will want to add a toggle. And I've prepared a toggle, which I can comment into my HTML. And that's just going to add a button. And here, what I've done is that I've used custom elements. So I use this is navbar toggler syntax. And what that does is it tells the browser to look for it provides an interface as a custom element. I'll show you the custom element code here. So with newer versions of browsers, the navbar toggler let me roll that back a little bit. So with vanilla JavaScript, if I want to write this behavior, I write something like this. Here I have a toggle function, and I look and I see if the class list has the hide class. If it does, I remove it, and if it doesn't, I add it. That's pretty simple. I'm not using the toggle function here because I also want to add the set the attribute correctly, the area expanded attribute, so that it works with the screen reader. But with custom elements, what it lets me do is that it lets me hook this toggle button in to the browser lifecycle when this custom element is defined. So here I can say define navbar toggler with this class, and this class extends HTML button element, so I need this extends button here. But what that does is before we would have to, at the end of our script, at the very end of our file, we would have to initialize all of the JavaScript we wanted and hope that the HTML that we need to initialize our JavaScript is on the page. But this allows us to just insert the HTML with this attribute, with saying this button is a navbar toggler, and the browser knows as soon as the button has been created that it will then activate the function that I want. So prepare that in advance. And so you can see then I have this toggle button here, which will expand and contract my navbar. I do want this element here, I want them to be shown next to each other. So if I can do that with CSS, find my I can do display flex. I'll justify content space between, and that will pull these elements apart from each other. And they are also not aligned, so I can do that with align items. Items center. Okay. So that's here. What I have another one, have a nav bar now. But when it's on a larger viewport, I want to show all of the items. So how can I do that? I can use media screen. I can use a media query. So I can say it's a screen, and my min width should be 40 rem. So here I'm using, I suggest looking at this article here. I've linked it, the 100% correct way to do CSS breakpoints. That's how I came up with the 40 rem thing. So here my nav bar is, and I want to say is nav bar toggler. I don't know, I would just say this. I would do that non-scoping. Display none. So, sorry, to finish my CSS. So on a larger screen, I want to hide the toggler, but I want the items to be shown. So what I can do then is I can say zone hide display. I mean, you could do block, but what I want to show you here is what I want to do is I want to so the reason that one question you hear a lot is when do you use CSS Grid versus Flexbox? Well, here my answer is if you're working with things in one dimension, Flexbox is good. If you're working with things in 2 dimensions, Grid is good. Flexbox aligns things in just one list of things, basically. So here I'm working in one direction, and I want these to be shown next to each other. So actually, I can just say display flex, and the default behavior is to flex direction row. So then I have this nav bar, which looks pretty good, but I can also make my nav bar itself just have display flex, and that should. Yeah, so there I have my nav bar. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you is how you can kind of style a nav bar using Flex. Now I'm going to come to CSS Grid. So I'm going to try to speed up. So here I'm just going to, I'll just get quick. So for the mobile layout, I actually think this layout looks pretty nice. I mean, minus spacing, but it looks okay. But because I would want the heading and then my search bar and then the content and then this this newsletter field at the bottom. But when I'm on a larger viewport, I want to have this these elements on this sidebar instead. And what I can do with this is I can say screen, just write that. I can do my what is it? My main display grid, and I can use grid template areas, and I can just use, basically it's like ASCII art. I can just create header regions, search region, content region, and a nav bar region. So each row is like a string, and you can create different areas in that area. And then it's magic, almost. So here we have, this is exactly what I wanted. And this is what the main thing I want to show about CSS Grid is that it's very declarative. So the site search is bothering me because it should have site line self, and so by default the items align themselves in a grid box and they stretch. So what I did there is I just said I want this to not stretch over the whole height of the row. I just want it to align itself to the end of the row. But here what I want to show is that that with 2 lines of code, I've created a grid layout. And in this instance, this is the default behavior of CSS Grid, is that the so each element I just define on the container. I say display grid, and then I just place the elements, like the elements that are children of my grid, will just automatically be assigned. By default, they have a grid column and grid row span of 1. So they'll just place themselves inside the grid according to the grid that I defined. And I really like that. Someone's asking any tutorials, pages, webinar, mocks, or something where backend developers can learn the basics of CSS. I would look at anything by Jen Simmons and anything by Rachel Andrew. Rachel Andrew has a newsletter which she sends out weekly, which is amazing. That's my recommendation on the fly. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so that's, I think, mainly what I wanted to show here. The other thing I wanted to show is that what we can do, really, really cool thing. So what I can do here is I can use position sticky. This is one of my favorite CSS commands. So here, 1 line of code, or 2 lines of code, sorry, and my little search box will remain sticky. And I can do the same for the newsletter. I want to just align itself to the start. Top. Here I have to use a value for top, which is not 0. Okay, that's too high. But here, one thing I like about the variable input is you can go through here and modify like different values. See what that looks like. So it looks like Excel is. So that's one thing I wanted to show is just with 2 lines of code, you can add position sticky and it remains sticky at the top. And I really like that because it's also like it's progressive enhancement in the sense that like for Internet Explorer 11, the position sticky doesn't work, but the default behavior is just to remain static on the page. And I think that's a good default behavior. Okay, Robert, am I okay on time? Because I did want to show one more thing. Okay. So now I want to show this. I want to use an implicit grid to style these links, or these links kind of thing. They're actually articles inside of a list. I wanted to style them using CSS Grid as well. And so this time I'm going to be using an implicit grid. So if I use a grid command like this, I'm creating an explicit grid, which has different, what do you call it? It has different, so it has different column numbers which start, yeah, so it's, if I look at, let me just show that real quick. This is the Grid Explorer from Firefox. So if you can see the grid, the actual grid which is being placed in it, and this is an explicit grid, so it always has 2 columns and 2 rows. But I can also create an implicit grid for my content, and I can define, so I want this to be display grid as well. And the default for display grid is just to show things on top of each other. So if I don't specify the number of columns or rows, it is a grid, we can see, but it has a grid with 1 column and as many rows as is needed. But what I can do is I can say grid template columns, and I can repeat autofill, and autofill will say it helps me create grid like the number of columns based on the amount of space that is available for the grid. So if I use something like repeat autofill min-max 15 rem auto, I hope that works. Oh, it worked, because that's one command that I often have difficulty with. But then it is a grid which we can see that it changes based on the amount of items that I have to show and an amount of space on the viewport. And I'm literally wrote 2 lines of CSS, and I have this this responsive functionality. Here I want to use the gap property. Space small to create a gap between the items. And I also want to style them like cards. So I think I created a card class on the articles. Yeah, I created. So here, if I use so if I use here I'm going to give it a border gray, and I'm going to give it a padding. So that it looks a bit like a card. I can give it a box shadow as well, because box shadows, I like box shadows. Okay. Okay, so then I have my cards. I can see that here, because the article is inside of this little these little boxes. So I'm gonna give it a height of 100%, so that, because it's inside of the LEs, which are inside of the ULs, so it's not taking up the stretch. So that looks a bit odd. I think I might have to do this styling actually on the LE. It's just a, like, do on all the children. I think I still need that actually for later. Yeah, okay. I don't know exactly why that's weird. I would have to play around with that a little bit. But the other thing I wanted to show is that I can make, so like I said, by default, the items in the grid, they will say, I want to take out one column or one row. But what I can do is I can say the first item, so first, use the first child. And I always do something silly like I check my CSS commands by doing like changing the background color to purple, just to make sure that the selector is correct, which is just a bit silly. But what I want to do here is I can use grid column, and actually I think I want to do this. I'll do it here first, and then I'll move it into a media query. And I want to say, please, for the first child, this is the most important item. So I want that to span 2 in my grid. I could also do this here. In this instance, I could do this with grid, with actual grid, the grid row number. So if I look at my grid, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the grid numbers. And you could say, so you can say that like this. So grid column 1 to 3. But then if you do something like, I no longer want my first child, I want my nth child to, like, I want the second child, then that will apply to the second child, but it also places it from 1 to 3. So I personally like this span 2, because it says, as a child, I don't really care where I am in the grid. I just want to stretch myself out and make myself take all the space I need. So then I have this this command, which the span 2, it'll just say, for this child, whatever, regardless, I want it to take 2 columns and 2 rows. And the cool thing is then you can add, like, you can be creative with your CSS and create this kind of, turn it off. So you can create this kind of interesting layout, which, like, this is just saying every 5th child I want it to have this behavior. And so with one line of CSS, or one CSS command, I can just write it like that. But in this instance, I just want my first child. But I said before, this is one thing, it looks pretty good, but on smaller viewports, it shouldn't span 2 columns. So I'm actually going to pull this into a media query here at the end. Media. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to copy that command in there. So then that will only activate for large, for larger viewports. But then I really like this. So this is just with this is implicit grid, so it just takes up the amount of space which it has to take up. And that's pretty much all I have to do. So I would show one last little thing here. in my card, so this is an example of where I would use Flexbox within CSS Grid. So here you can see we've created a CSS Grid, and I believe that on like the main layout of the page, I want to use CSS Grid because it's very declarative. I don't have to add, with CSS Grid, I don't have to add like wrapper classes to wrap my columns and wrap my rows. I can just create very declaratively, I can create the main layout, the main grid layout for my the layout that I want to use. And I like it, especially on this level. I love using CSS Grid because it's just amazing. But for like in this instance, I have a grid, so I have this container. This container is a grid. But for these elements, I want to style them a little bit. The main thing is I want this the authors here to pop down to the bottom. And so here I am. I'm styling again in one dimension, not in two dimensions. So then I would reach for something like Flexbox. So here I'm going to display flex. I'm going to say the flex direction is column, not row. So by default it's row, but I want it to be column. And with Firefox and newer versions of Firefox, and I think they're getting it, and it's now in Chrome, or almost in Chrome, and I'm so excited. You can also use the gap property within Flexbox, which will add this this gap in between items, but it doesn't mess up the margins or the padding around it. And then the other thing is I wanted to pop this down to the bottom. So I can do that by saying card authors margin top auto. And the last thing I want to say is so this is kind of one of those examples with this margin bottom command. This is actually how CSS was designed. The Flexbox was designed. The spec says we already know that people are using margin auto in order to position things with as much space as they need to be positioned. So we're just going to integrate that into the Flexbox spec. So this is not actually a CSS hack. This is how we can pull one element out of a Flexbox. That's by design. That's how the Flexbox spec defined it. Yeah. So that's pretty much all I have for you today. I just wanted to show you kind of how I can do different things with modern CSS. I think I answered the questions that popped up in the Q&A.
Yeah, let's see if we still have some open questions.
Yeah, we can look.
There's one by Theo, the first one. Why is the convention starting with 2 underscores? I think he meant the variable names you've been using. Yeah, I tried to answer that. I think it's just how it was designed. I think it's probably a syntax which hadn't existed in CSS, so you could insert it without breaking things. That would be my guess. All right. There's another one. The second one, did you answer it already?
I think so. Yeah, the second one is about preprocessors. And I think, so with one reason is if you do have to support Internet Explorer 11 for some reason. I mean, I do think like for enterprise applications, that's still a thing that needs to be done often. Then preprocessor is good because Internet Explorer 11 doesn't support CSS properties. For newer browsers, if you don't have to support them, I think less and less, we need to use preprocessors less and less. But as I said before, I do like preprocessors for this kind of code where I'm having to prefix the variables all myself instead of using a preprocessor to scope all of the styles for a specific item. Yeah.
Okay, great. And the question you already tackled, are there any good tutorials, pages, webinars, something else where backend developers can learn the basics of CSS? Actually, I think there's a book, front-end development or specifically CSS for backend developers. Just Google it. There must be something like that.
I like I think it's CSS Secrets is a book I read a while back because I am a backend developer. I wasn't wasn't a backend developer. I still am a backend developer, but I also do CSS. And I liked that book. I thought the description, like the explanations of what CSS is and why you'd write it the way you write it, were pretty decent. Yeah. And anything by Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrew, highly recommended.
Yeah, definitely. Also, Lea Veru posts lots of good stuff on the topic. I think she still does. She used to post a lot of that. Yeah, so whatever comes to our mind, we'll post it later on in the comment section on this meetup event.
And
thank you.
I also recommend, this
worries,
Flexbox Froggy game. This Flexbox Froggy game, and there's a CSS Garden game as well for kind of playing around with Flexbox and Grid. I think it's fun.
Didn't know that one. Yeah, funny thing was, I think we've been all there at this point where we been using funny colors to highlight our stuff to debug things. I had to laugh quite a bit when you showed it. Yeah, but thank you so much. I think it was a great demo into CSS Grid and what it can be used for. I think we're pretty much on time. Soon it's turning 1. I hope everyone had a good time. You could easily follow. Please feel free to join our meetup group. I posted it in the YouTube and Zoom chats. And to get notified for new live streams and events, specifically this INNOQ Technology Lunch nowadays. And next week, on Wednesday at the same time, we get another talk by my dear colleague Ben, and he will be talking about naming things, especially commit messages and code. That could get interesting. All right, so Joy, do you have anything to add?
Just that I'm planning on I'm going to put this on in a GitHub repository, and I will probably tweet out the link shortly. My Twitter handle is @IamJoyHeron. So I will tweet the code from this this live demo briefly, maybe in 15 minutes or so.
Great. We'll also post hopefully a high definition recording of this event. If everything worked out smoothly, let's hold our thumbs. That takes a bit of time, but we will post the recording. So if you want to recap on that, or if you want to join us a bit later, it will be available. And we'll post that on our Twitter, on our meetup group. Feel free to join us anywhere. Also, all the recordings of our past technology lunches are already available on our YouTube channel. Feel free to browse over there if there's something in for you. Otherwise, I would like to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Joy, for giving the demo. And see every one of you hopefully next Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Bye.